November 30th, 2004, the final day of the Atlantic hurricane season. Across Florida, from the battered shores of Pensacola to the storm-weary streets of Key West, millions are still grappling with the catastrophic aftermath of the most relentless hurricane season since Andrew ravaged South Florida in 1992. Within a span of just 6 harrowing weeks, from August into September, and for the first time in nearly 120 years, 4 hurricanes, including 3 monstrous major hurricanes, unleashed their fury on the Sunshine State, each leaving its own devastating mark on Florida's landscape and its people. By the time the season ended, 125 lives had been tragically lost, and nearly $40 billion in property damage had transformed vibrant neighborhoods into scenes of ruin. Today, let's journey back into the heat of the action, revisiting a hurricane season that even a generation later remains etched into the collective memory of Floridians who lived through it, to remember why the 2004 season was so impactful and explore its legacy here in the great state of Florida. I'm CJ, and this is Florida Man Weather. The 2004 Atlantic hurricane season stands out as one of the most active and destructive on record, producing a total of 15 named storms, 9 hurricanes, and 6 major hurricanes. Yet, at the start of the year, few in the scientific community actually expected the season to be so active. Skepticism remained widespread because early indicators, such as a weak El Nino forming in the Pacific, typically point towards suppressed hurricane activity in the Atlantic. For this reason, many meteorologists assumed the basin would be spared from the widespread destructive storms. This sense of uncertainty only made what followed all the more remarkable. The well above average level of activity that ultimately unfolded was not a random occurrence. Instead, it resulted from a unique alignment of large-scale atmospheric and oceanic conditions that collectively primed the entire tropical Atlantic basin for frequent and intense tropical cyclone development. One of the most significant drivers of this hyperactive season was the presence of above-average sea surface temperatures across both the tropical Atlantic and the Caribbean Sea. Warm ocean waters serve as the fundamental energy source for tropical cyclones, fueling their growth through the release of latent heat as warm, moist air rises and condenses. And in 2004, sea surface temperatures were not only elevated, but persistently high over a wide area, meaning that storms that formed had abundant energy available to support rapid intensification and maintain their strength over extended periods. This anomaly in the sea surface temperatures greatly increased the likelihood that even weak or struggling tropical disturbances could quickly blossom into organized and powerful hurricanes. However, warm ocean waters alone cannot explain the exceptional nature of the 2004 season. Other large-scale atmospheric patterns also aligned in a highly favorable way. For example, the Madden-Julian Oscillation, or the MJO, which is a recurring pulse of enhanced tropical rainfall and convection that travels eastward around the globe, was in a phase that promoted upward motion and atmospheric instability across the Atlantic basin during much of the peak of hurricane season. This enhanced convection increased the likelihood that tropical waves emerging from Africa would consolidate as tropical depressions and ultimately become tropical storms and hurricanes. At the same time, vertical wind shear, that's, remember, the change in wind speed and direction with height, was abnormally low across the Atlantic's main development region, or MDR. High wind shear tends to disrupt developing cyclones by tilting and tearing apart their vertical structure. But in 2004, the exact opposite is what occurred. Reduced wind shear allowed storms to remain vertically aligned, which is critical for sustained intensification. This meant that once a tropical system began organizing, it faced few obstacles to becoming a full-fledged hurricane. Understanding this broader context underscores just how unprecedented the 2004 season seemed, particularly given the early doubts that it would be active at all. It also highlights the inherent challenges these conditions pose for long-range seasonal forecasting. Predicting exactly when and where these storms will make landfall remains impossible, but recognizing that a season is likely to be exceptionally active can help coastal communities better prepare. What began as a modest tropical system in the Caribbean near the Lesser Antilles in early August of 2004 rapidly evolved into one of the most intense hurricanes to ever impact Florida, Hurricane Charley. At first, Charley appeared to be a typical Cape Verde type storm, moving steadily northwestward and promoting forecasts that suggested a landfall somewhere in the Tampa Bay area. For days, hundreds of thousands of residents in that area braced for what was expected to be the worst storm to impact Greater Tampa Bay since 1921. Hundreds of thousands of Bay Area residents boarded up their homes and hit the road, headed inland towards cities like Lakeland, Orlando, and Ocala in what, at the time, was the largest hurricane evacuation in history. But in the final hours before landfall, Charley would defy expectations in truly devastating fashion. Charley's track would take a small but impactful jog to the east, shifting the bullseye away from Tampa Bay and directly into the vulnerable communities of Charlotte and Lee counties. These rapid changes in the storm's intensity and track occurred so quickly that forecasters and residents alike had precious little time to adjust. And by the afternoon of August 13th, 2004, Charley made its first landfall in the United States near Cayo Costa in Lee County, Florida, and then roared ashore on the mainland into Charlotte Harbor and Punta Gorda in Charlotte County, all as a Category 4 hurricane. Charley had become a compact but violent storm, with its eye just a mere 7 miles wide, a size that belied the immense destructive power it carried within, packing sustained winds near 150 miles per hour and gusts well over 160. Punta Gorda experienced catastrophic wind gusts of over 115 miles per hour, while even inland cities such as Orlando, 100+ miles from the Gulf Coast, recorded sustained winds of nearly 80 and gusts over 100. The reason for this is Charley's forward speed, over 20 miles per hour, is across the Florida Peninsula. This meant that hurricane-force winds swept across the state in just a matter of hours. The storm, in fact, traversed from coast to coast in only about 7 hours, exiting near Daytona Beach into the Atlantic as a weakened hurricane before striking South Carolina as a Category 1 on the following day. But while Charley's swath of hurricane-force winds was relatively narrow, the destruction within that corridor was catastrophic. Entire mobile home parks in Punta Gorda and Port Charlotte were obliterated, reduced to twisted wreckage in a matter of minutes. Even well-constructed homes lost roofs and exterior walls, exposing the interiors to the elements. Businesses, schools, and government buildings were shredded by Charley's compact core of extreme winds. Survivors and media likened the core's path across the state to that of a 7-mile wide tornado. The storm's unparalleled ferocity in inland locations such as Orlando prompted the National Weather Service office in Melbourne to do something completely unprecedented. That WFO, which has responsibility for the Space Coast and Greater Orlando, issued tornado warnings to encourage residents in the path of Charley's core to shelter in place. The storm laid bare the vulnerabilities of Florida's built environment, particularly older structures and mobile homes that predated the state's strengthened building codes of the late 1990s. The inadequacy of these codes, particularly for lower income housing types, became painfully evident as thousands were left homeless overnight. Charley's assault also triggered a cascade of infrastructural failures. Its destructive winds toppled power lines across southwest and central Florida, cutting electricity to more than 2 million residents. This widespread power outage also crippled communications. Cell towers and landline networks dependent on the electricity failed, leaving entire communities isolated from critical emergency updates and unable to call for help. Roadways were choked with fallen trees, and debris compounded the crisis. The storm's sudden turn away from Tampa Bay left many in Charlotte and Lee counties with barely any warning. Nearly 800,000 people had evacuated Tampa Bay, remember, including many who headed toward the Orlando area, thinking it was safe and out of the path of Charley's fury, only to find themselves having to ride out Charley's core while the places they'd left were mostly spared. This devastating near miss for Tampa Bay underscored the challenges of forecasting the path of small, fast-moving hurricanes and highlighted the need for improved communication about forecast uncertainty. The hurricane claimed 15 lives in Florida and caused many more injuries, and its economic toll was staggering. It demonstrated that inland communities such as Orlando were not immune to hurricane-force winds and destruction, and it underscored how easily small, intense hurricanes could be underestimated by the public. As the first of 4 hurricanes to impact the state in just 6 weeks, Charley was a sobering wake-up call. Its suddenness and ferocity shattered complacency and set the tone for what would become a relentless, exhausting marathon of storms for Floridians in the weeks that would follow. Just 3 weeks after the devastation of Hurricane Charley, Florida was once again in a hurricane's crosshairs. This time, it would not be a small, fast-moving storm that arrived suddenly with little warning. Instead, Hurricane Frances approached like a looming giant, testing the state's resilience and patience in a way far different from its predecessor. On the night of September 4th into the early morning hours of September 5th, Frances finally came ashore. Landfall occurred just after midnight on September 5th near Seawalls Point and Hutchinson Island on Florida's Treasure Coast, with maximum sustained winds near 105 miles per hour, making it a Category 2 hurricane. But wind speed alone did not define Frances. Its slow, lumbering forward speed, barely a crawl at 5 to 8 miles per hour, meant that the hurricane would subject vast swaths of Florida to unrelenting punishment. Unlike Charley, which had crossed the state in only 7 hours, Frances would take an agonizing 24 hours to creep from the Atlantic coast to the Gulf. By mid-afternoon on September 5th, the storm center was still in central Florida near Bartow, and by nightfall, it was hovering near Tampa as a tropical storm. Frances would not finally exit the Florida peninsula until nearly midnight on September 6th, eventually making a final landfall in Florida's Big Bend region near St. Mark's as a tropical storm. This drawn-out passage was Frances's most devastating feature. Prolonged hurricane-force winds, pounding rains, and storm surge battered east and central Florida for hours on end. Entire communities along the Treasure Coast, already weary from weeks of storm preparation after Charley, endured gust after gust as shingles peeled from their rooftops, trees toppled, and power lines snapped. Near the landfall point in St. Lucie and Martin counties, many homes and businesses suffered roof loss or severe flooding. Inland communities, such as Orlando, Kissimmee, and Bartow, were subjected to hours of strong tropical storm to hurricane-force winds, the prolonged stress steadily weakening roofs, windows, and structures that might have survived a faster-moving storm. Even areas as far away as Tampa and the Gulf Coast were lashed by high winds as Frances slowly churned its way across the peninsula. The storm's sluggish pace also unleashed extreme rainfall. Portions of eastern and central Florida recorded widespread rainfall totals of 6 to 10 inches, with localized amounts of over a foot to 15 inches in interior regions and along the Nature Coast. Rivers and creeks that were already swollen from the summer thunderstorms surged over their banks. Low-lying communities were inundated, and some river basins remained flooded for days after Frances departed. Saturated ground combined with the persistent winds caused countless trees to topple, blocking roads and further complicating response efforts. At its peak, Frances knocked out power to between 4 and 6 million people in Florida, with more than 3 million customer accounts reported without electricity at one time. For many, the outages last well over a week, a cruel blow to residents who had only recently restored power in Charley's wake. The prolonged outages, waterlogged homes, and supply shortages took a heavy toll on Floridians' morale. Shelters overflowed as thousands were forced to spend multiple nights in secure buildings, waiting out the storm's grinding march. In the lead up to landfall, already rattled residents scrambled for scarce supplies. Frances ultimately caused another estimated $9 to $10 billion in damage in the United States and was directly responsible for 8 fatalities. The storm was another vivid reminder that the destructive potential of hurricanes is not measured solely by their category or peak wind speed. Frances' immense size and slow movement magnified its impact, showing that even a Category 2 can devastate a region if it grinds over it for long enough. As exhausted Floridians cleared the mountains of debris and began yet another round of repairs, they had little idea that their ordeal was far from over. Frances had left behind a state physically and emotionally battered, but still only halfway through the historic hurricane onslaught of 2004. As Floridians were attempting to recover from the 1-2 punch of Charley and Frances, the Atlantic seemed to want to give no time to recover. Barely had debris been cleared from roads and power lines restrung when another monster rose from the ocean's depths. Hurricane Ivan, a massive and fearsome hurricane, was marching westward across the Atlantic. As the storm headed west, it would earn a reputation of destruction. Ivan had already torn a catastrophic path through the Caribbean, battering Jamaica, Grenada, and the Cayman Islands as a Category 5, leaving destruction so complete it seemed unimaginable that the United States could be spared a similar fate. And by the time Ivan approached the Gulf Coast in mid-September of 2004, its immense circulation had filled nearly the entire eastern Gulf. Though it had weakened slightly from its peak ferocity, Ivan remained a lethal force, a large, high-end Category 3 hurricane with sustained winds of around 120 miles per hour. The storm's eye was forecast to cross the Alabama coast, but the slight difference offered little comfort to those in Florida's western panhandle. The front right eye wall, the most violent quadrant of any hurricane, was set to rake the Florida coastline of Escambia County head-on. Just before dawn on September 16th, Ivan's eye came ashore near Gulf Shores, Alabama, but for the Florida panhandle, it was as though the eye had passed directly overhead. Coastal communities in Escambia County and those to the east from Pensacola Beach to Navarre were pummeled by unrelenting winds and an even more terrifying threat, the storm surge. Pensacola Bay and surrounding inlets became unrecognizable as walls of water surged inland from the storm. Entire neighborhoods were swallowed by seawater. Homes perched on barrier islands like Pensacola Beach and Navarre Beach were obliterated, many torn from their foundations and carried away by the water. Ivan's storm surge produced one of the most harrowing images of the entire 2004 season, the catastrophic failure of the Interstate 10 bridge over Escambia Bay in Pensacola. As the bay's raging waters slammed into the bridge's concrete supports, 58 spans gave way. In an instant, a massive portion of this vital highway link collapsed into the churning waters. One 18-wheeler, attempting to cross the bridge at the time, plunged into the abyss as the structure disintegrated beneath it, killing its driver and symbolizing Ivan's unrelenting power. The destruction in Escambia and Santa Rosa counties was staggering. Countless homes, including many built to modern codes, were damaged or destroyed. Roofs were peeled from houses like the lids of tin cans, while saltwater inundated entire neighborhoods, leaving behind piles of debris and waist-deep muck. Downtown Pensacola was inundated, its streets transformed into rivers. Landmarks like the Pensacola Beach Pier were ripped apart and swept away. Inland, Ivan's size and strength produced heavy rain and significant freshwater flooding across rivers and low-lying areas, compounding the misery for the residents already battered by the wind and surge. Power outages were nearly universal across the entire western panhandle. Virtually every resident of Escambia and Santa Rosa counties lost their electricity, many of whom would remain without power for weeks. Roads were blocked by toppled trees and bridge failures, isolating neighborhoods and leaving emergency crews struggling to reach those who were in need. Ivan's wrath did not stop at the shoreline, however. As it moved inland through Alabama and into the southeast, it spawned a massive tornado outbreak. Dozens of twisters tore across Florida's panhandle and the broader southeastern U.S., shredding homes and adding to the destruction. Florida alone recorded 14 deaths from Ivan, with many more injuries and additional indirect fatalities in the days that followed. Central and South Florida, by contrast, were largely spared direct effects this time due to Ivan's westward track. In places like Tampa Bay and Southwest Florida, the storm's distant periphery brought little more than dry, sinking air and the occasional squall. But this offered no real relief. Even those out of Ivan's reach watched in dread as the storm bore down on the panhandle, aware they too could have been in the crosshairs. And for many Floridians still reeling from Charley and Francis, Ivan's approach was yet another reminder of their own vulnerability. In total, Ivan would cause more than $13 billion in 2004 dollars in U.S. damage, ranking it as one of the costliest hurricanes in history at the time, and claiming over 90 lives, including 25 in the United States. For Florida, the storm underscored a deadly truth. Storm surge is often the most catastrophic element of a hurricane, capable of erasing entire communities in a matter of hours. It also exposed the extreme vulnerability of barrier islands and low-lying developments, forcing difficult conversations about coastal zoning, building codes, and evacuation planning. Yet, amidst the ruins, there were glimmers of resilience. The destruction of the Escambia Bay I-10 bridge left the panhandle economically paralyzed, but within just 17 days, a temporary Wonder Bridge, as it was dubbed, was constructed and opened. a testament to determination and rapid recovery under pressure. By the time Ivan's final remnants had dissipated, Florida had endured 3 hurricanes in just over a couple of weeks. Exhausted, but still bracing for more, its people could only wonder what fresh challenges the rest of the 2004 season would bring. As if Florida had not already endured enough, the atmosphere had one final cruel act in store. Just 3 weeks after Hurricane Francis had clawed its way across the Florida peninsula, Hurricane Jeanne emerged in the Atlantic. Its arrival felt almost surreal, a cruel twist of fate for communities still reeling from the unrelenting assaults of Charley, Francis, and Ivan. Jeanne formed from a tropical wave in mid-September and spent days wandering the Atlantic in an unpredictable path, even performing a rare, complete clockwise loop over the Bahamas. All the while, steadily gathering in strength, its spiral bands stretching wider and wider until it also became a formidable Category 3 hurricane with sustained winds nearing 120 miles an hour. For those along Florida's east coast, the forecast track was like a waking nightmare. Jeanne was on course to strike the same exact stretch of coastline that Francis had devastated just 3 weeks earlier. This eerie similarity defied belief and yet was undeniable. Then, on the night of September 25th to 26, 2004, Jeanne again came ashore near Stuart, Florida, virtually in the identical landfall point as Francis, with a well-defined eye and a violent eye wall. Residents in Martin and St. Lucie counties once again braced for another round of hurricane-force winds, with many sheltering beneath roofs already patched with tarps, hoping their temporary repairs would hold. Jeanne's forward speed was faster than Francis's, but it was still deliberate enough to inflict hours of sustained winds across a vast area. The storm plowed west-northwest across the heart of the Florida peninsula, carving a path almost indistinguishable from Francis's. Coastal areas from Stuart and Fort Pierce were lashed with 100 to 120 mile-per-hour sustained winds, tearing apart homes and businesses that had only just begun rebuilding. Tarp-covered roofs failed in droves. Structures weakened by previous storms were now battered beyond repair. Many of the same inland counties already reeling from Charley and Francis, like Polk, Hardy, and Highlands, were struck again, this time for the 3rd time in 6 weeks. Jeanne's impacts compounded everything that had come before. Flooding was widespread, with rainfall totals somewhere between 5 and 10 inches across the peninsula. In some areas, swollen rivers and saturated soils left behind by Francis worsened the situation. Barrier islands and coastal communities endured a storm surge of 4 to 6 feet, which chewed away beaches and battered dunes already scoured by Francis. Across Florida, power outages, again, were extensive. More than 2.5 million homes and businesses were plunged into the darkness, some for the 2nd or even 3rd time that season. For many, the outages dragged on for days or weeks, once again bringing fresh waves of frustration and despair. Temporary repairs to the utility networks were undone. For first responders, the repeated disasters were crippling. Fatigue was evident in their faces and voices, and resources were now being stretched to the breaking point. Jeanne's destruction was not just physical. It struck at the very essence of communities in its path. Families who had endured Francis only to watch Jeanne tear away their remaining possessions found themselves displaced, many permanently. Businesses that had been able to reopen after Francis were now reduced to rubble, pushing some into bankruptcy. This cumulative impact was not merely additive, it was an economic and psychological multiplier. Recovery was set back weeks, if not months, and the sense of despair was palpable in the streets. And by the time Jeanne exited the state, passing over the Gulf Coast as a weakening tropical storm, Florida's ordeal had reached a level without precedent in more than a century. No state had suffered 4 hurricane landfalls in a single season since Texas did 118 years before, and the cumulative toll was staggering. More than 25 to 30 billion in insured losses in Florida alone from Charley, Francis, Ivan, and Jeanne, with total economic losses climbing even higher. In Jeanne's aftermath, the state was physically and emotionally shattered. Communities faced mountains of debris, gutted homes, ruined businesses, battered coastlines, and tattered infrastructure. By the time hurricane season had ended, Florida was left to grapple with a question no one wanted to ask. How would it ever recover? The 2004 hurricane season etched itself deeply into Florida's collective memory, marking a historic and harrowing chapter in the state's enduring relationship with nature's fury. For Floridians, 2004 had began as an ordinary summer, one which quickly transformed into a relentless ordeal that tested their resolve, preparedness, and resilience. Each storm left indelible scars, physically, economically, socially, and environmentally. The human toll was also tragically severe, with 137 total lives lost, both directly and indirectly. The unprecedented frequency and intensity of the 2004 storms prompted significant reflection and adaptation. Emergency management protocols evolved swiftly, emphasizing better resource allocation, streamlined logistics, and clearer communication strategies. Also, Florida's building codes, which were already stringent post-Hurricane Andrew, were further tightened to ensure newer structures would withstand powerful hurricanes. Insurers revamped risk assessment models, enhancing their ability to cope with future catastrophic losses. And probably the most positive impact from the 2004 season was that public awareness had surged dramatically in the state of Florida. Driven by lived experiences that transformed abstract warnings into personal realities, Floridians became vigilant, embracing preparedness as a necessity rather than an afterthought. One striking example of improved public awareness efforts in hurricane emergencies comes from the 2004 season, where forecasters at the National Weather Service's Melbourne, Florida office recognized that standard hurricane warnings did not fully convey the ferocity of an approaching major hurricane's core. During Hurricanes Charley and Jeanne, the Melbourne office took the unprecedented step of issuing tornado warnings to alert those directly in the path of the storm's eye walls, urging them to take immediate shelter as if a tornado were imminent. Remarkably, no direct wind-related fatalities occurred in East Central Florida during either storm, an outcome likely aided by this intense focus on warning communication. The National Weather Service's Hurricane Charley service assessment subsequently hailed Melbourne's eyewall warning strategy as a hurricane preparedness best practice for future events. The success of these ad hoc warnings led the National Weather Service to actually establish the official extreme wind warning in subsequent years, a specialized alert now reserved for sustained winds above 115 miles per hour that carries the same urgency as a tornado warning. This evolution in warning strategy has greatly enhanced public awareness and encouraged prompt action when the most destructive winds of a hurricane approached land. In the decades that followed 2004, Florida transformed significantly. The lessons learned spurred robust reforms across emergency management, infrastructure, resilience, insurance policy, and public education. The legacy of 2004 endures not merely as a record of devastation, but as a powerful narrative of adaptation, perseverance, and communal strength. Floridians emerged stronger, more informed, and better prepared for future storms. Ultimately, the mean season of 2004 stood as both a stark warning to those about the years to come and still serves as a profound testament to human resilience, forever defining Florida's intricate dance with hurricanes and Mother Nature itself. Hey everybody, I hope you really liked this video. If you did, please feel free to give it a thumbs up and make sure to like and subscribe, ring that bell so you don't miss more content like it in the future. Thanks again, CJ with Florida Man Weller.